June 4, 1942. In just 5 minutes, the most powerful naval force on Earth was reduced to burning wreckage. Japan entered the Battle of Midway expecting another easy victory, but by sunset, its dream of ruling the Pacific had begun to die. How did 4 unstoppable aircraft carriers fall so quickly? The answer changed World War II forever. Before we uncover one of the greatest turning points of World War II, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Every day, we reveal the untold battles, hidden strategies, and forgotten moments that shaped history. Now, let's go back to the morning when an empire sailed straight into its own destruction. June 4, 1942. Before sunrise, north of Midway Atoll, the Pacific was a sheet of dark metal, its surface barely moving beneath the sky still waiting for color. On the flight decks of the Japanese carriers, men moved through the half-light with the practiced precision of a navy that had not yet learned to doubt itself. Aviation fuel hung in the air. Engines coughed awake. Signal lamps blinked over black water. Far below, the sea breathed against steel holes, and somewhere in that mechanical dawn lay the old confidence of empire, the belief that this day would be another step in a flawless ascent, another island, another victory, another proof that Japan's will had already outpaced the rest of the Pacific. The men on those decks did not yet know that history had begun to narrow around them, that the ocean ahead was no longer a road outward, but the mouth of a trap. In the 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Empire had moved with a speed that made it seem almost elemental. The Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and the Dutch East Indies fell in succession. British and Dutch positions collapsed. Allied maps were redrawn again and again, each new arrow pointing farther outward from the home islands. To many Japanese officers, this was not merely expansion. It was vindication. It seemed to prove that daring, discipline, and offensive spirit could compensate for raw industrial disparity. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, understood better than most how dangerous time would become if the war dragged on, and so Midway was conceived as a decisive stroke. Capture the atoll. Draw out the surviving American carriers. Destroy them. Place Japan behind what the U.S. Navy later described as an impregnable eastern shield in the Central Pacific. If Midway fell, Hawaii would feel nearer, America would feel weaker, and Tokyo might force a negotiated settlement before American industry could turn the ocean into a factory floor. Midway was therefore not a remote coral target. It was the hinge on which Japan hoped to lock the Pacific into a new imperial order. That is why the battle mattered before the first bomb fell. It mattered because beneath the visible fleets, another war had already begun in basements, code rooms, and repair docks. In Hawaii, Commander Joseph Rochefort and Station HYPO had pierced enough of the Japanese naval code to identify AF as Midway, then confirmed it with the now famous deception message about a broken water distillation system and a shortage of fresh water. When the Japanese transmitted that AF was short on water, Admiral Nimitz had his certainty. He reinforced the island, positioned Enterprise and Hornet east of Midway, and sent the damaged Yorktown, patched in extraordinary haste at Pearl Harbor, back into battle. The contest that Japan imagined as an ambush had already been turned inside out. And there was another contrast, quieter but revealing. Only weeks earlier, when Lexington was lost in the Coral Sea, sailors abandoning ship were remembered grabbing ice cream as they went over the side, an almost absurd image in wartime, yet a revealing one. America, even wounded, fought from within a civilization of repair, supply, refrigeration, and mass production. Japan still seemed sharper. America was becoming deeper. The emotional contrast at Midway was therefore immense. Japanese aviators launched into the dawn expecting a hard but manageable operation, one more demonstration of the superiority of the Kido Butai, the carrier striking force that had already stunned the world from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. They expected another opponent caught off balance, another American response arriving too late, another victory that would deepen the aura surrounding the Imperial Navy. The Americans, by contrast, entered the battle from a very different state of mind. They had reason for fear. Pearl Harbor was less than 6 months behind them. Their material position in the Pacific was still fragile. Their torpedo squadrons would go forward in aircraft that were slow, vulnerable, and often doomed before release. Yet fear and ignorance are not the same thing. The Americans were frightened, but they were not blind. They knew where Japan intended to strike. They had radar. They had warning. And they had commanders who were willing to gamble the remaining carriers of the Pacific Fleet on one violent, narrow, calculated opportunity. Midway would become the moment when Japanese confidence met American preparation, when expectation collided with information, and when a victorious empire first discovered that it had sailed into a future designed by its enemy. At dawn on June 4th, the Japanese first strike came in with force. More than 100 bombers and fighters from Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu descended on Midway. Oil tanks burned on Sand Island. Anti-aircraft batteries answered. Marine fighters rose and were mauled. But the attack did not finish the job. Radar and prior warning had allowed Midway to launch its aircraft before the bombs arrived, and the island's runways remained usable. The result was strategically fatal. From the Japanese strike leader came the assessment that a second attack was necessary. Japanese records later preserved the judgment in stark terms: there is a necessity for carrying out a second attack. On paper, that sounded rational. In practice, it began the sequence that killed the Empire's carrier arm. Admiral Nagumo ordered aircraft that had been prepared for anti-ship strikes to be rearmed for another blow against land targets. Bombs and torpedoes were removed, shifted, stacked, and in some cases left exposed in the rush. Fuel lines, ordnance carts, and half-turned aircraft filled the decks and hangars. What had been an elegant offensive instrument became, for a brief and catastrophic interval, a warehouse of explosives. The deeper tragedy was that Japanese doctrine had built itself around speed and concentration, yet on that morning speed was consumed by uncertainty. The carriers had no radar. They depended on scout aircraft, and an earlier delay in launching those scouts meant that critical information arrived late. Nagumo first prepared for a second strike on Midway, then reversed course when contact reports suggested American ships nearby, then found himself trapped between incompatible necessities: recover the returning strike from Midway, rearm for anti-ship warfare, launch a fresh attack, and somehow preserve initiative. Meanwhile, the Americans, scattered, imperfectly coordinated, and often poorly timed, were nevertheless closing from several directions. One of the strange truths of Midway is that it was not won by a single flawless action, but by a series of improvised American thrusts that kept the Japanese off balance long enough for one perfect window to open. This was a battle fought almost entirely from the air across hundreds of miles of ocean. As the FDR library later noted, ship commanders never even saw their opponents. Yet the invisible geometry of the fight was decisive. Every delayed scout, every deck cycle, every turn to avoid bombs or torpedoes widened the seam in Japan's plan until fate could enter it. The first Americans to arrive in force paid for that widening seam with their lives. Torpedo squadrons from Midway and the carriers came in low and slow against fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Their attacks achieved almost nothing in direct material terms. Torpedoes missed. Formations were shredded. Men died in water and flame. But sacrifice is not measured only by immediate impact. Radioman Second Class Harry H., farrier of Torpedo Squadron 8, remembered the attack with brutal clarity. On the second firing pass by the attacking Zeros, our turret gunner, Manning, was hit and his turret put out of action. The sight of his slumped and lifeless body startled me. Quite suddenly, I was a scared, mature old man at 17. Farrier's Avenger was one of the very few to return. Of 41 American carrier torpedo planes committed in those attacks, only 4 came back. Their squadrons were wrecked. Yet by dragging Japanese combat air patrols downward and forcing violent evasive maneuvers, they helped clear the high sky. The empire that had expected a controlled execution found itself burning time against men who seemed to throw away their lives with terrifying resolve. Then came the moment around which Midway has revolved ever since. As Japanese fighters descended to sea level to finish the torpedo planes, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived overhead. They found what Lieutenant J.G. Norman Dusty Clyce later called the carrier pilot's dream. In his recollection, there was no anti-aircraft, all three, Japanese, carriers heading straight into the wind. He watched bombs strike Kaga and saw the whole pack of planes at the stern, in flames 50 feet high, then moments later, flames 100 feet high. This was the terrible arithmetic of carrier warfare in 1942, dozens of aircraft, fuel, bombs, torpedoes, elevators, and hoses compressed into a few exposed acres of steel. One hit might disable. Several would annihilate. Within minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were raging furnaces. The elegance of Japanese offensive doctrine, honed in victory after victory, had no answer once fire entered those packed decks and hangars. A navy that had begun the morning believing it could summon battle that will now fought simply to survive its own machinery. There is a temptation to treat those few minutes as pure miracle, but miracles at Midway were made from structure, from broken codes, from radar warning, from Nimitz's willingness to commit, from Rochefort's persistence, from Yorktown's rushed repairs, from doomed torpedo squadrons, and from a Japanese doctrine that prized offensive sequencing over flexible recovery once surprise had been lost. Still, from the human point of view, it felt like catastrophe descending from a clear sky. Japanese pilots returning from the strike on Midway expected orderly recovery, hot fuel, rearming crews, and the familiar choreography of carrier war. Instead, many returned to smoke pillars and decks in ruin. The first real sensation of defeat in the Central Pacific was not abstract. It was visual. Black smoke. Buckled steel. Flames licking through parked aircraft. The smell of burning aviation gasoline over salt water. For months the Empire had looked outward and seen only space to conquer. At Midway it looked back and saw its own center on fire. Yet the battle was not over. Hiryu, the one surviving Japanese carrier, still had teeth. Her air groups found Yorktown and struck with precision. The American carrier, already scarred by Coral Sea and barely restored for battle, took bombs and torpedoes and fell dead in the water. For a moment, Japanese professionalism reasserted itself. They had been hit with shocking force, but they were not yet helpless. This, too, mattered. Midway was not a collapse of courage. Japanese aviators and sailors fought skillfully and with extraordinary determination even as disaster closed around them. But now they fought from within shrinking options. American scouts soon found Hiryu, and dive bombers from Enterprise attacked in turn, leaving the last operational Japanese carrier burning. The sequence gave Midway its unique psychological shape: triumph in the morning, shock at noon, retaliation in the afternoon, extinction by evening. An empire that entered the day with 4 frontline carriers left it with none capable of continuing the operation. The Americans did not leave untouched. Yorktown, though initially stabilized by determined damage control, could not be saved in the end. On June 6th, the Japanese submarine I-168 torpedoed Yorktown and the destroyer Hammond, the latter sinking so quickly that the violence of the underwater explosions killed men already in the sea. Lieutenant J.G. Charles C. Hortigan of Hammond later recalled seeing torpedoes on the starboard beam and then, after the hit, finding the forecastle awash, the bridge nearly empty, the ship disappearing beneath him in minutes. Yorktown herself lingered until June 7th before capsizing and sinking. These losses matter because Midway was not a bloodless American epiphany. It was a violent exchange in which the United States paid heavily, especially in aviators. Nearly 150 American aircraft were lost, and hundreds of sailors, Marines, and airmen died. But the ratio of damage was transformed by scale and replacement. The United States could grieve Yorktown and still imagine rebuilding. Japan could not lose 4 fleet carriers and hundreds of highly trained aircrew without cutting into the marrow of its future. By the final reckoning, Japan had lost the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with a heavy cruiser, hundreds of aircraft, and roughly 3,000 men, about 3,057 by one major museum estimate. The United States lost Yorktown, Hammond, and far fewer personnel, roughly 362 in the National World War II Museum's accounting. Even more devastating than hulls or aircraft was the loss of trained pilots and deck crews. Naval History and Heritage Command emphasizes that Japan lost more than 100 experienced aviators at Midway who could not simply be replaced. That truth often disappears behind the drama of burning carriers, but it was central. Carriers are built in shipyards. Carrier air groups are built in time. Japan had spent years forging an elite instrument of naval aviation. Midway did not merely damage that instrument. It snapped it in the middle of a war that was about to become longer, wider, and more industrial than Tokyo had hoped. This is where the title becomes true. Midway did not defeat Japan by itself. Empires do not usually die in a single afternoon. They crack, bleed, cracken, and then discover too late that they are living on borrowed momentum. What Midway did was transform Japan from a conquering empire into a future defeated empire. Before Midway, Japanese strategy still possessed initiative. After Midway, that initiative bled away. Planned advances toward New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa were cancelled or postponed. The strategic horizon shrank. The operational question was no longer how far Japan could extend its power, but how long it could preserve what it had already taken. Britannica is explicit that Midway brought the Pacific naval forces of Japan and the United States to approximate parity and marked a turning point in the military struggle. The FDR Library notes that it shifted the initiative to the Americans and opened the way to Guadalcanal. In other words, Midway converted the war from a Japanese offensive into an American approach. That change of grammar, the shift from Japan acting in America reacting to America acting and Japan reacting, was the beginning of imperial defeat. For American perception, the transformation was equally profound. Pearl Harbor had created anger, but not certainty. The first half of 1942 had been a season of retreat, improvisation, and damage control. Midway did not end fear, yet it gave the United States something more durable than revenge: proof. Proof that Japanese expansion could be halted. Proof that intelligence could defeat surprise. Proof that damaged carriers could return to battle and matter. Proof that American naval aviation, for all its confusion and losses, could still strike with murderous effect. Midway therefore became a psychological counterweight to Pearl Harbor. The earlier attack had exposed vulnerability. Midway revealed capacity. And because Americans experienced that revelation not as propaganda alone, but as a documented, measurable victory grounded in losses, wreckage, and strategic consequences, it became one of the few moments in war when morale and reality aligned. The nation no longer had to imagine that eventual victory was possible. It had seen the direction of that victory begin. For Japan, by contrast, Midway was not only military loss but ideological injury. Imperial doctrine had leaned heavily on concepts of spirit, offensive daring, and the decisive battle that would break an enemy's will before material disparity could assert itself. Those ideas were not meaningless. Japanese crews and pilots proved their skill repeatedly. But Midway exposed the limits of a war philosophy rooted in brilliance without depth. Courage could not compensate for delayed scouts. Operational excellence could not compensate for compromised intelligence. Tactical confidence could not compensate for an industrial system unable to replenish elite aircrews at American rates. The empire had believed that a few crushing victories could settle the Pacific before democracy had time to organize its weight. Midway showed the opposite. It showed that a democracy, even when shocked and divided, could gather science, industry, maintenance crews, codebreakers, and exhausted sailors into a coherent response. Japan did not lose at Midway because its men lacked bravery. It lost because bravery had been placed in service of a strategic equation that could not survive surprise lost and attrition gained. There is also a quieter way to understand the battle, and it lies in the systems behind the gunfire. Midway is often remembered as 5 or 10 dramatic minutes of dive bombers over burning decks. But those minutes were underwritten by the less cinematic machinery of a modern republic: code rooms, dry docks, machine shops, radar sets, fuel depots, replacement aircraft, and floating logistics. Rear Admiral Warnell Reed Carter's official Navy history later wrote that in the Pacific, all operations against Japan hinged on logistics. The United States created temporary bases and mobile service squadrons that carried food, ammunition, repairs, and fuel close to combat areas, allowing the fleet to maintain unrelenting pressure without retreating to distant home ports. This is one of the reasons Midway turned Japan into a defeated empire rather than merely a checked one. Japan had counted on decisive battle. America was assembling decisive endurance. When the U.S. service force grew from 51 craft in 1940 to 2,930 ships by July 1945, it was expressing in steel what Midway had first revealed in combat, that the Pacific would not be won by the side that struck first, but by the side that could keep arriving. And here the recurring symbol returns, ice cream, improbably soft amid steel and smoke. It seems almost indecent to mention sweetness in the same historical breath as burning carriers, but war often reveals itself through contrasts too strange to invent. The U.S. Naval Institute records that the Navy treated ice cream as a serious morale concern and eventually converted refrigerated barges into floating ice cream factories producing roughly 1,500 gallons a day. Even earlier, when Lexington went down in May 1942, sailors remembered grabbing ice cream as they abandoned the ship. That is not a detail of strategy. It is a detail of civilization. It suggests a military culture sustained not only by obedience and sacrifice, but by a supply system so expansive that it could preserve comfort at the edge of destruction. One can over-romanticize abundance, of course. American democracy had its exclusions, contradictions, and brutalities. But in the Pacific it also possessed a material generosity that empire could not match. Japan could launch the finest carrier strike force on Earth. America, in time, could deliver cold sweetness into tropical war zones while replacing carriers, training air crews, and extending floating repair cities across the ocean. Midway was the moment when that asymmetry became visible. So when Japanese officers and sailors tried to understand what had happened at Midway, they were not merely looking at a tactical upset. They were looking at a revelation. The United States had not answered Pearl Harbor only with anger. It had answered with analysis. It had not answered Japanese naval skill only with courage. It had answered with preparation. And it had not answered imperial ambition only with force. It had answered with a society capable of turning industrial plenty into military persistence. That is why the battle altered perception on both sides. Americans began to see that they could roll westward, island by island, and that the empire was not immortal. Japanese leaders, whether they admitted it fully or not, had to confront a terrible new fact. The war they hoped to end quickly had now become the kind of war they were least prepared to survive. After Midway came Guadalcanal, the long attritional grind, the island-hopping advance, the submarine strangulation of shipping, the rise of Essex-class carriers, the steady thinning of Japanese pilot quality, and the increasingly desperate attempts to reverse a tide that no longer recognized imperial will. Midway did not script every later battle, but it established the logic they would follow. Japan would fight skillfully, often fanatically, sometimes brilliantly. Yet from this point forward, it would do so under a shadow cast by June 1942, the knowledge that the initiative had passed, that carrier supremacy had been broken, and that time itself had changed allegiance. The empire could still kill. It could still resist. But resistance is not the same as direction. At Midway, Japan ceased to be the author of the Pacific War and became, little by little, its subject. And so the meaning of Midway lives not only in wreckage charts or carrier silhouettes, but in a larger truth about power. Empires often believe they are strongest when fear surrounds them. Democracies often appear weakest when argument, repair, and imperfection are visible on the surface. But argument can adapt. Repair can recover. Imperfection can learn. On the morning of June 4th, Japan came to Midway carrying the authority of recent triumphs, convinced that discipline and audacity had bent history in its favor. By nightfall, 3 carriers were burning, a 4th was doomed, and the empire had glimpsed the thing that would finally destroy it, not merely American firepower, but American depth. Not merely bombs, but codebreakers. Not merely pilots, but mechanics. Not merely courage, but replacement. Not merely victory, but endurance. In the end, perhaps that is why the image of ice cream belongs here after all. Because Midway was not only about how nations destroy. It was about how nations sustain. A regime built on hierarchy, conquest, and scarcity met a republic that, for all its flaws, could still feed, repair, improvise, and renew itself across an ocean. One system could summon a decisive strike. The other could survive the failure of one, the loss of one, even the sinking of one, and still continue. Freedom in war is never gentle. It does not arrive as innocence. It arrives in welded seams, decoded messages, crowded runways, deck crews under pressure, and strange surviving luxuries carried thousands of miles from home. It arrives in the ability to lose and return, to burn and rebuild, to suffer and still believe there will be another morning. At Midway, Japan discovered that it had awakened not just an enemy, but a civilization of immense reserves. And from that discovery flowed the long, irreversible sentence of defeat.